Thank you, Bobby. Oh, wow. Thank you, Bobby Wrinkle, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen. What a crowd. I know that some of you, like David Boswell and Judge Russell, drifted in here thinking this was the orientation for the tasting committee for the barbecue. That's actually down the street, guys. Yeah. Thank you so much, and thank you, Bobby, and my compliments to Bobby Wrinkle and the library for the wonderful series of Thursday evening upstairs. They have wonderful programs. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to make many of them. I was able to make Todd Hatton when he spoke about John Scopes, a fascinating program, and I'm always looking forward to receiving word on what programs are being given here. When I was driving down here tonight, my wife Paula, who's heard this story about the Night Riders lots of times, said, "You're not going to tell the whole story tonight, are you?" I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, you're not going to tell the whole Night Rider story, are you?" And I said, "Well, I don't know. They came to hear about the Night Riders." She said, "Why don't you ask them who all's read the book?" I said, "You don't ask people who raised their hands who read your book." I said, "I'm going to give them the whole load." Joe Creason, the columnist, the Courier Journal from Old Benton, told the story about this young seminarian who graduated from the seminary and got his first church out in a remote area there in central Kentucky. He was really excited about his first service. He spent all week long, it was in the wintertime, he spent all week long preparing his sermon. And real long sermon, actually, because he wanted to make a good impression. So Saturday night before the first service, they had a huge snowstorm. So when he got to church that morning, only one person showed up. One old farmer showed up. So he had his big speech to get him ready to give this young farmer, and he thought, I don't want to really waste all this work and research on one person. I think I'll save this sermon till later on, Leon, till when there'll be a whole crowd there, see, like tonight. So he told the farmer, he said, "Sir, I had prepared a long sermon here for this morning, but since there's only one coming, if you don't mind, I'm going to forego and not give it, and I will just talk, to give a brief talk here, if that's okay with you." The old farmer said, "Well, son," he said, "if I was out feeding my cows on a day like today and I had only one cow to show up in the back lot, I'd feed that one cow." So he said, "Okay, here goes." So he went into his sermon with that one old farmer sitting there, and he went on and on and on and on. And about an hour and a half later, he finished up the sermon. He asked, "Well, sir," said, "what did you think about that?" He said, "Well, like I was saying, if I was going to go out to feed my cattle and I only had one cow to show up, I wouldn't give him the whole load." So I'm going to give you the whole load. Actually, you'll be glad to know they've got me on a timer. I've only got 3 hours. So I got to be out of here in 3 hours, so we don't have to worry about that. It's that time of the year. It's that time of the year. As the days grow short, the evenings grow crisp, and if you're out in the hinterland, out of Paducah, out of the bright city lights of Paducah, and you get out into the back country of West Kentucky, the tobacco smoke weaving up the tobacco barns, this pungent odor, and there are ghosts upon this land. It's the ghost of the Night Riders. Several years ago, I spoke to a Kentucky preservation group in the courtroom in Princeton, Kentucky, and I told them about far west Kentucky, and I am so proud to be from far west Kentucky. I tell them that far west Kentucky is haunted by two wars, the Civil War and the Black Patch War. And standing there in that Caldwell County Circuit courtroom, I had the emblems and symbolism of it right there behind me, because down in the corner is the Confederate monument, and emblazoned and molded into the concrete facade of the courthouse at Caldwell County are tobacco leaves. And Princeton has a tobacco festival. Just had a couple of weeks ago, the Black Patch Festival. Yeah, we're haunted in this far west Kentucky by those two wars. Tomorrow night, there will be a reenactment of the raid on Hopkinsville, over in Hopkinsville, Kentucky. Saturday morning, we're going to be over talking about the Night Rider books. Saturday afternoon, we had a round table about the Night Riders. Saturday night, we're going to have a reenactment in the old courtroom over there of the trial of David Amos. And then, of course, as I said, we had the Black Patch Festival not long ago, and we're not through yet. Sunday afternoon, I got to go down to Adams, Tennessee, Robertson County, where Felix Ewing, the Moses of the Black Patch, lived, and we're going to have tales of the Red River and talk about the Night Riders. We go down to Adams, Tennessee, and we sit there in that old school, and there's three guys that go up there, William Turner, historian from Hopkinsville, and Rick Gregory from Robertson County. Now we sit there and just talk for an hour about the Night Rider, and they have 200 or 300 people that come in for that. I'm telling you, it is even 111 years to this day, when they first had the Black Lanterns Protection Association meeting in Guthrie, it still invades this culture and still haunts people. This crowd here tonight is to hear about the Night Riders. It's something about it that is intriguing. The question is, why? Why are we still so interested in this fascinating story? Well, there's something about it that grabs us. It's purely American, for one thing. This classic American struggle between labor and capital. And it fits into the greater picture of our country at that time. You had the railroad workers, you had the miners, you had the factory workers, you had the violent uprising, you had the beginning of organized labor. It's just armed conflict. In the Black Patch in West Kentucky and West Tennessee, you actually had two armed groups. It was a war. It was the Black Patch War. And we learned that our version of that labor capital struggle had a fascinating ending that's purely American, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. Well, we know we're not really a state that lives up to our motto. I was in Madisonville a couple of nights ago, and I've always thought it was ironic that we had this motto, united we stand and divided we fall, when we're the most divided, fractious state in the Union. I mean, we've been divided from the time we got here fighting the Indians all the way up through the Civil War, Night Riders. I mean, today we're always fractious, and no other time have we been so divided and so fractious as we were in West Kentucky during the violent uprising. And it was, as Bobby said, the most violent and sustained civil uprising in the United States between the Civil War and the race riots of the 1960s, and it happened here in West Kentucky and West Tennessee. And those people who are not native to it, who moved in here, are fascinated to learn about this. And the people who are natives are fascinated to learn more and more about it, because it was a secret fraternity, which took us years and years really to find out and plumb the depths of that organization, exactly what it did. Well, it was all about tobacco. You know, people look at the cover of my book and they see the mask, they immediately think it's some kind of racist group. I think it's some kind of offshoot of the KKK. It is not. It is a farmers' revolt. It's a farmers' revolt against the American Tobacco Company. And we have to keep in mind and move back and remember that in the early 1900s, tobacco was the only cash crop for the farmers. It was the money they made to buy essentials for living, for clothes, for coffee, for plow points, for things that was essential keeping their farm going, was made by the cash crop of tobacco. Dark fire tobacco grown in West Kentucky. It's the best place in the world to grow it. It costs 6 cents a pound to grow it. It took, in 1904, they were getting only 3 cents a pound. Why? Because James B. Duke formed the American Tobacco Company, formed the monopoly. He came from a poor tobacco family himself over in North Carolina. And they formed the monopoly, and they bought out all the competitors, and therefore they were able to come to West Kentucky and West Tennessee and offer the farmers a take it or leave it price. And it plummeted to 3 cents a pound when it cost them 6 cents a pound to grow it. Well, the farmers became restless, and they became determined to do something about it. And there was a big tobacco farmer over in Robertson County, Tennessee, who lived in this huge plantation home called Glen Raven, named Felix Ewing. Felix Ewing raised a lot of tobacco. And with the tobacco prices going on, he came up with the idea, him and several other people there in Robertson County and other places, to form an association. If the American Tobacco Company was going to monopolize the buying, then the association could monopolize the selling. They could take the tobacco, the farmers could keep it off the market, until they could drive the prices up, and the American Tobacco Company had to come to them with prices that were acceptable. This idea all came together 111 years ago today. On September the 24th, 1904, 5,000 people came together in Guthrie, Kentucky. How many people here have been to Guthrie, Kentucky? Can you imagine 5,000 people in Guthrie? I don't know where they were. But the reason they met in Guthrie was because it was right there on the Kentucky-Tennessee line, so it was handy to farmers from West Kentucky and Western, and it was a big railroad center, actually, at that time. And most of your travel, far range travel, was done by railroad, so it was a great place for people to come in east, west, from Tennessee. 5,000 people gathered there. They probably didn't have as much barbecue as we have in Paducah tonight, but they had a lot of it. And they had a lot of speeches from politicians, and they started damning the American Tobacco Company, which they called the Trust. And they started talking about this organization they're going to form, the association that was going to go around and have farmers to sign up. They're going to build their own tobacco warehouses. They're going to take the tobacco and keep it off the market and make the American Tobacco Company come with them with the farmer's price. So as they rattled away from there that evening, in their wagons and walking and on horseback and on the trains that pulled out of the station, they were pretty optimistic that at long last something's going to be done. You know, there's a saying, motion creates emotion. Well, they've been frustrated with these prices, and so they were decided that now that they were doing something, putting something in motion, they felt a lot better. So they were very optimistic as they left that evening to form these associations and form. Each county would have its own organization to get the association in line and collect the dues and build the warehouses, and they were confident that something was going to be done. But they ran into that independent streak of farmers. They could not convince many of the tobacco farmers that this was a good thing. The tobacco farmers, many of them said, no one's going to tell me where or who to sell my tobacco to. So they began to have in trouble with many of the farmers called independents, and it frustrated the farmers. And by the time the year rolled around and they arrived there in September 1905, there were 10,000 frustrated, irritated farmers that gathered there to vent their feelings of the frustrations that still existed. Well, they went home, but in just a month later, in October, there was a group of farmers, most all of them from Robeson County, Tennessee. Just as evening was closing in on the little school there called Stainback Schoolhouse on that October unseasonably short, warm summer fall evening, they moved into that, came to that little schoolhouse, and they tethered their horses, and they went in the one-room school. They pulled the shades, they lit the lanterns, and they began to talk in muffled tones. And what they were talking about was, what are we going to do about these independent farmers? What are we going to do to bring more people into the organization? And they came down with what was called the Stainback Resolutions. Stainback Resolutions consisted of a lot of things, but here was the most ominous of all. It authorized a committee, and here's the wording in the resolutions, a committee of 5 to 2,000 people to visit independent farmers. Well, that spoke ill right there of things to come. Crops were laid by. They had the evenings, so they would go out in groups and go talk to the farmers that were independent to coax them into joining the association. Well, what happened was confrontations began to flare up. Things began to break out of control. Violence began to bring up. They began out, and the ones that refused to join, violence began to be imparted upon them. They started burning their tobacco barns. They began to take them out and whip them. And this renegade group, militant arm, I guess you'd say, of the association became known first as the possum hunters, because possum hunters, go out at night. A.O. Stanley, who was the congressman from West Kentucky at the time, who was a great friend of the tobacco farmer, nevertheless got up in a speech in Springfield, Tennessee, and was lambasting the trust and was sympathizing with the farmer, but he criticized this violence that had all of a sudden erupted, and he said, this night riding has got to stop. And from that day on, the ignominious label of possum hunters slid out of use, and the name Night Riders was born. Who were the Night Riders? That's probably one of the most fascinating things about the Night Rider era. They were law-abiding and respected farmers, and even merchants and politicians, church-going members. The leader of the Night Riders, the little country doctor from over in Cobb, Kentucky. And I doubt very seriously many people here, I won't embarrass anybody by asking, very few people have been to Cobb, Kentucky. It's hard to get to from here. It really is. His house is still standing. But he was a country doctor. They had grown up in his formative years, a small boy during the Civil War, and he envisioned and heard great stories of the military leaders, Stonewall Jackson and Lee, and knew many of the veterans from some of those wars. So he began to envision himself as a great commander. He went to the military institute over in Hopkinsville called the James O. Farrell Military Institute, where they took drilling as tactics and military tactics at military school. He was a brilliant and frustrated little doctor, and a doctor because his father had been a doctor and his grandfather had been a doctor, but he was kind of frustrated. He had no war to go to. So when this idea came about of this vigilante group and the angry and hungry farmers, keeping in mind the little country doctors at that time, as well as most all merchants in these small towns, depended on the tobacco farmer for their income. He decided he was going to organize the Night Rider. He was going to be the leader of the Night Riders, and he proceeded to do just that. He organized them as a secret fraternity. They had passwords. They had pass signals. They would have their meetings in secret. They would meet in little country schoolhouses, country churches. Sometimes they'd meet just out in the woods. They'd always post sentinels around, and they initiated people to take the ironclad oath not to divulge the identity of its members, nor to divulge any of its plans, under an oath of penalty of death. Serious group. Their passwords would be to station the sentinel. They'd have a password whereby anyone gaining entrance would have to give a long whistle, and be a long whistle in return, and one would say, Silent Brigade, and then the sentinel would say, have you been there? And the person trying to gain entrance would respond, if he was to gain admission, with the secret words, yes, on bended knees. David Amos took this ritual, some of it from the Masonic order and some of it from the KKK. He went down to Nashville and got some of their ritual and incorporated into their own unique Night Rider ritual. You know, the location of the leadership in the eastern part of the Black Patch over in Caldwell, Tree County, in that area, is probably explains why we'll find that a great deal of the organized activity, most of the organized activity, like the taking over of towns and things, happened on the east side of the Tennessee River and the Cumberland River. A lot of activity here in the Purchase area, especially in Callaway County. But remember, the only way across the Tennessee and Cumberland Rivers in those days was by railroad bridges or ferries, neither one of which is pretty ever conducive to moving large mass of troops across who are trying to remain secret. You don't, I mean, you can't bring your 200 or 300 Silent Brigade members or go out on a raid on the train and not be noticed, right? Or on the ferry and not be noticed. So I think the location of the leadership of that had a lot to do with so much of this activity having taken place over there. What did the Night Rider actually do once they got well organized under the leadership of David Amos? Well, David Amos realized that taking of farmers out and whipping them, while it kind of vented the farmers' frustrations and their anger and all, didn't do really a lot of good in getting the job done, is getting the attention of the people who mattered most, and that was the people of the American Tobacco Company, of the trust. He knew that in order to get their attention, you got to hit them where it counts, and that is in the pocketbook. So that's when David Amos' military genius really began to show through. His strategy, his ability as a military tactician began to show in his leadership of the Night Riders when he began to plan large raids upon towns and tobacco centers in West Kentucky for the purpose of destroying that the trust tobacco that had been bought from independent farmers while it was in the warehouses in that town, and was this time of the year. This time of the year, September, October, November, December, when the tobacco had been sold by the independent farmers to the trust, brought into the tobacco centers of Princeton, Hopkinsville, Murray, Paducah, Russellville, Eddyville, and was hanging in the warehouses, that he started to break his plans to hit them where they would be hurt most financially. So, the first raid was on December the 1st, 1906, whenever a group of about 300 night riders formed, their faces masked. We put gurney sacks over the horses' feet so to muffle their sounds. And about midnight on December 1st, 1906, they moved 300 strong into the streets of Princeton, Kentucky, to take over the town, dynamite, and burn the 2 tobacco warehouses there. Many years ago, when I first started gathering my research material to write the book on bended knees, I was teaching a class for the University of Kentucky history class. Everybody wants to study about the night rider. So I just sent the class out with tape recorders in the community. That was 35 years ago, and there are still people alive then who were children who remember that Princeton raid. We got a lot of primary sources of people who remembers the frightening nature of these masked men coming into town. People pulling up their shades and turning on the light and bullets ringing out toward them. They took over the telephone office and took the operators hostage and wouldn't let them call out. They went over and caught the fire brigade and the police playing cards, almost half asleep, took them under hostage and wouldn't let them react. And then the group moved in with military precision, dynamited, burned the 2 tobacco warehouses, causing $1,000 worth of damage, congregated, synchronized on the court square with a whistle sound that David Amos would make to gather his troops together by blowing the end of his pistol barrel. They gathered together, all started out in a very orderly fashion, 2 abreast, finding their way out of Princeton, Kentucky, singing to the tune of My Old Kentucky Home, "The fire shine bright on my old Kentucky home." Well, it was a huge success, but the people, the place they really wanted to go, and the place they really thought they could impart the most damage, was this huge tobacco center of Hopkinsville, Kentucky, which was pretty good sized town at that time. They had the railroad there, and it was the center of that area of tobacco growers. They had 2 or 3 warehouses there that was sated in the fall of 1907. That would be the big granddaddy of them all, the mother of all night rider raids, if you could pull off raiding Hopkinsville, because Hopkinsville not only was a tobacco center, but it had a lot of resistance there. The mayor of Hopkinsville, Charles Meacham, was an adamant opponent of the night rider. He was the editor of the Kentuckian. He wrote scathing editorials against the night riders. He was a mayor, led leadership. The militia, Major Bassett, had a militia that was stationed there. So no one really thought they were going to raid Hopkinsville, but David Amos had a different mind. On the night of December 7th, 1907, they pulled off basically the same kind of raid they did on Princeton a year before. They went into Hopkinsville, 300 of them strong. They disabled the fire brigade. They also held the police hostage. They also went and held the telephone communicators hostage. They moved in there in perfect precision and organized form, and they burned the Latham, Tandy, and Farley warehouses. It was sated with the trust tobacco to the ground, causing thousands and thousands of dollars worth of damage. This raid, though, would be done at a cost. First of all, when they were down around the depot there, and there's a historical marker today, little David Amos was wounded accidentally by one of his own troops. So they didn't know how bad he was bleeding profusely from his head, so he had to leave town. He told the troops, be sure you set up a good rear guard and as you make your retreat, and he left town, was taken over to Wallonia. If you've never been to Cobb, I know you've never been to Wallonia, but Dr. W.C. Hayden was a Night Rider sympathizer with the doctor that treated Dr. Amos, and found out it was basically, in spite of all the blood, it was a superficial wound, and he fixed him up and put a head bandage on, and he was not seriously injured, but he had to leave early. So the group was kind of leaders. They're a little bit careless as they're leaving town, and they let down the rear guard, and they were pursued by a posse, and also it was led by Mayor Charles Meacham and Major Bassett, part of the militia. They were pursued as they went out through the kind of the Cadius Road, and they were surprised, and a gun battle ensued. It was something out of a Wild West picture show. Here came the Night Riders heading down on horseback, and here came the posse pursuing them and shooting them. And 2 Night Riders were wounded, one of them mortally, on that particular evening. Clancy McCool was wounded, and George Gray was mortally wounded and died from his wound. And so they managed to escape, but the Night Riders sustained the first fatalities on that heroic raid upon Hopkinsville. The impact of that raid made the front pages of all the major newspapers of the back east. The Charlotte Observer, the New York Times, all had headlines saying Kentucky riders attack and set fire to West Kentucky town. So David Amos had got the attention, even though it was with a cost. There was a humorous episode that happened on that evening. Though Charles Meacham, as I told you a few minutes ago, was an adamant anti-Night Rider editor of the Kentucky newspaper. He was mayor of town, and really he's the one who kind of, as a last gap effort, got the posse together to chase them. When the Night Riders went to Hopkinsville that night, they had told David Amos that if we get things done and we get business taken care of and the warehouses are burned, we'd like to pay a visit on Mr. Meacham. We'd like to pay a visit on him. Well, Charles Meacham heard all the commotion going on downtown. He got up as mayor of his city. His town was on fire. Think I'll go down and see what's going on. Big mistake. Almost a big mistake. As he headed down there, the Night Rider spotted him. He was an easy guy to identify because everybody knew who he looked like. Tall, lanky, bald-headed guy that was easy to identify on this. So there goes Charles Meacham, and he was on foot. And they gave chase to him on horseback, and they chased him through the streets of Hopkinsville, and he went down this alleyway that was a dead-end alleyway right there at where the First Baptist Church of Hopkinsville was. The Night Riders moved in, and Charles Meacham looked all around. There was no exit. So he turned to face his fate of being done harm by these Night Riders who were chasing him with strong vengeance in their hearts. The Night Riders thought they had him trapped until Charles Meacham spotted this coal chute going down into the basement of the First Baptist Church. And incredibly, because this guy was like 6'4", 6'5", incredibly, I guess you do anything when you think your life's endangered, he got in that coal chute and slid down into the dark, dank, but secure basement of the Hopkinsville Baptist Church. Well, this is a real quandary for the Night Riders because they really wanted Charles Meacham, but hey, guys, this is a church. I mean, what are we going to do? Are we going to go in there and beat this guy up in the church? And they finally decided that Charles Meacham had bested them, and they let him go. But they were able to use it as the butt of the joke from then on because they went around saying that Charles Meacham was the only sprinkled Methodist saint saved in a water-dunking Baptist church. Another little humorous thing about that raid was a story of a New York drummer. You know, the drummers were the people who came around selling things from the big cities in the Northeast, and they'd come to these small towns in the South, and they really didn't want to go down there to start with. I guess these were the guys who were kind of blowing the totem pole for these companies. They'd send them down to places like Hopkinsville. This drummer, and I know what he was selling, probably a variety of things, was sent to Hopkinsville. Well, the word of the Night Rider movement had already reached throughout the Northeast, and he knew about the Night Riders. He didn't want to go. And they said, you go to Hopkinsville, you're going to be fired. So he didn't have any choice. So he arrived, luck would have it. Yep, he arrived on the night of the Hopkinsville raid. He got into Hopkinsville a little before midnight, and he went and had a bite to eat, and then he went up to his hotel room and checked into his hotel, lay down to go to sleep, and then, excuse the vocabulary, but all hell broke loose. The night riders arrived, they were shooting, there was fires being set. He got under his bed, bullets were whizzing through his room. He got under his bed, hid under his bed to daylight. When daylight came, and he went immediately to the telegraph office, and he telegraphed his employer back in New York. And here's what the telegram said. Back then, if you sent telegraphs, you would write a sentence and you'd say stop for a sentence for a period. So he sent the telegraph to his employer in New York. He said, arrived Hopkinsville midnight. Stop. Checked into hotel at 1. Stop. Night riders fill room with bullets at 2. Stop. I quit. Stop. He packed up and went home. You know, there were other towns that were raided as well, none as successful as much monetary damage as Hopkinsville. Eddyville on February 16, 1908. And I really don't have time to give you the full load, but I had an interesting conversation when I grew up knowing an old man named S.M. Martin, but I had an interesting conversation when I was gathering information about this book with Mr. Martin. He was 101 years old. He was the town marshal. The night the night riders came to Eddyville on February 16, 1908, and that was quite an exciting night. They went to Dykesburg in February of 1908, and they not only burned the tobacco warehouses down there, but they also burned the distillery owned by Henry Bennett and went out and beat Henry Bennett almost to death. In fact, he died about a year later, and the wife has inscribed on his tombstone in the Dykesburg cemetery, killed by the night riders. Whether he was or not is open to debate, but they inflicted a terrible beating on him. And I had the occasion to talk to the last night rider over in Lyon County, the last night rider, and he was about 100 years old in great health, Joe Scott. And if you see the documentary on Bending Knees, they have an interview with Joe Scott, and it's an incredible interview. Joe Scott was on the Hopkinsville raid, and he was on the raid when they went and beat up Henry Bennett. And he told about the details of that terrible beating they inflicted upon Henry Bennett. Russellville was raided. Tobacco warehouse destroyed on January 3rd, 1908. They tried to get over in the Purchase, never thought about coming to Paducah, but they seriously thought about going to Murray. Murray was a great tobacco center at that time. So in Murray, on January 23rd of 1908, they made plans to raid Murray. But by that time, the reputation of the night riders taking over towns had gotten everybody's attention. So the time they gathered that evening when they gathered to go to Murray, they headed across the ferry and they came toward Murray. But at the same time, the governor had activated the state militia and sent the militia to Murray. The militia beat the night riders to Murray. And whenever the leader of that night rider raid on Murray heard about it, they turned around and left. Murray had a close call. Murray had, in Callaway County, had a tremendous amount of night rider activity. They had a county judge, J.C.W. Wells, who was adamantly against the night riders, stood up against the night riders. So that was had a lot to do with Murray resisting the night rider raid and never being able to make a raid upon Murray. In the midst of all of this going on, there was a woman involved. One of the most spirited women to ever come out of West Kentucky, and her name was Mary Lou Hollowell. Mary Lou Hollowell was a good-looking 40-year-old brunette who lived over in Caldwell County, Kentucky, out close to Nabb's schoolhouse. Her and her husband, Robert, and little boy Price lived on this farm, and they raised our tobacco. Mary Lou was good-looking and well-formed, and that made her unpopular with the women. She was opinionated and aggressive and arrogant. That made her unpopular with the men. She married into the Hollowell family, but she really didn't like them very much. And she never got along with them. And she certainly didn't get along with her brother-in-law, John Hollowell. So whatever the Hollowells were involved in, she was against. Well, the Hollowells, John Hollowell, was one of the leading night riders in Caldwell County. So that put her on the other side. So Mary Lou was an adamant anti-night rider. And she let it be known. Going around the country stores, the church socials, she spoke very much against the night riders, knowing that the Hollowell family is very much involved in it. And as you can probably gather by now, Robert didn't say anything because you know who wore the pants in that family. Pretty dominating. In the summertime, they lived out on the farm, and in the wintertime, Mary Lou and the little boy Price, 12-year-old Price, moved into Princeton, and she ran a boarding house there. She took in boarders, and she served meals. The interesting thing about that boarding house there in Princeton, she served great meals, had great food, had a big clientele. In fact, some of the leaders of the night riders, David Amos, Guy Dunning, and some of the leaders of the night riders and public officials who were all night riders or sympathizers of the night riders, would eat there during the daytime. And they said she had good food. She was a gracious and outgoing hostess. She was said to serve her dimples with her dumplings. Anyway, Mary Lou Hollowell began to talk around and say, you know, I know who was involved in that December raid on Princeton. I can name names because I heard them talking about it at my table in my boarding house. And I'm going to go over and see the grand jury when it comes in session in April, and I'm going to get some people indicted. Well, nobody paid any attention to Mary Lou. They thought she was just bravado, and they really hadn't paid any attention to what she was saying until in April 1907, the grand jury came into session in Caldwell County, and lo and behold, Mary Lou goes over to the courthouse, walks up to the grand jury room, and asks to give testimony. She goes in the grand jury room, all male, 12 members of the grand jury, 7 of them night riders, and she sits down and starts to tell the names of all these people she knows is involved in the Princeton raid, thinking that she's going to get indictments against those people. Well, they didn't return any indictments. But what they did do, they said, you know, Mary Lou is getting to be more than just a little thorn in the side. We need to pay her a visit. So they sent out the Hoe-Toters. The Hoe-Toters was a specialty group of the night riders. And you know what their specialty was? Scraping plant beds. And this is in the spring. This is April, May. They sent the Hoe-Toters to Mary Lou's farm and scraped the plant beds. Maybe that'll teach her a lesson. When Mary Lou and Robert got up the next morning and went down and surveyed the damage, Robert kind of accepted it with, you know, benign resignation. This is what Mary Lou gets us into. Mary Lou blew a gasket. She became so mad that she decided she was going to retaliate. So she got 2 of her hard hands, Ned Pettit and Steve Show, and to go and scrape the plant beds of a couple of night riders, namely one of them, her brother-in-law, John Hollowell. Sure enough, 3 or 4 mornings later, their plant beds came up scraped. Well, you know, night riders having their plant bed scraped is something else. Sheriff didn't bother to come investigate Mary Lou's plant bed being scraped, but he was out there the next morning investigating this. Of course, everybody pretty well knew who did it, especially when they found a day book that Steve Schultz had dropped by mistake. They went straight to Steve Schultz. He named Ned Pettit. They took them both downtown and got confessions out of them and said Mary Lou paid us $5 to do it. So, getting serious. So with that, the sheriff just kind of folded his investigation and, quite frankly, turned it over to the night riders. Well, what would happen then would be one of the most dramatic raids the night riders made, and turned out to be a fateful raid they made. They decided we need to get rough with Mary Lou. So on the night of May the 1st, there were 30 of them that went out to Nab's schoolhouse, tied their horses there, and they walked across the field to Mary Lou and Robert Little Price's home. They'd already gone to bed. They circled it and started shooting into the home with rifles and shotguns breaking through the windows, ricocheting off the walls. Mary Lou grabbed Price. She rolled onto the bed. They kept shooting, and finally she screamed that they were coming out, and they stopped shooting. Mary Lou, little Price, screaming, yelling, total out of his mind with fright, and Robert come out into the little yard there, another huge hackberry tree, and under the flickering shadows of the fire bands, and they held her to a tree and Robert to a hill and whipped them really hard. They told them both when they'd finished, they were laying prostrate on the ground, bleeding, you leave Caldwell County or you will be killed. So the next morning, his son came up over that little farmhouse, and the livestock wandered untethered through the yard. The crops went unattended. The house was vacant. Mary Lou and Robert and little Price had packed their bags, packed their trunks, gone to the depot down there at Princeton, caught a train, and came to Paducah. Well, after a few days, they began to mend physically. And it didn't even take a few days for Mary Lou's spirit to revive, and she decided she wasn't going to take this. She could name every one of them because they didn't even bother to put on masks. She could name all 30 of them that came out there and imparted this tremendous assault and crime upon her and her husband and scared her little boy out of the daylight. She was going to do something about it. Well, what's she going to do about it? Nobody brought any action against the night riders out in these state courts because the officials were night riders. You had sheriffs who were night riders, grand jurors who were night riders. You had judges, prosecutors, Commonwealth attorneys that were night riders. There wasn't going to anything be done, either criminally or civilly. They were almost immune from prosecution. There was actually, as I've learned more and more as I go along, it was actually a larger number of what they called hillbillies, the independent anti-night rider group, than I had previously thought. It wasn't hardly 50-50, but it was close. But anyway, most of the officials, especially in law enforcement and the justice system, had night rider sympathy. There's no way she's going to be able to get an indictment, be able to get a criminal charge. She'd already tried that. But she went to see a brilliant young lawyer here by the name of John Miller, who was practicing law. John Miller was from Princeton. He went to see her and told them about that. And John Miller was moved by this injustice. He was moved by their injury. He was moved by her plight. And he decided to take her case. And he said, I want you and Robert and Price to move to Evansville, Indiana. And then I want you to come back and see me in about 10 months, 11 months. So they moved up to Evansville, Indiana, and they came back in early 1908 to see John Miller. And John Miller then, Judge Russell, you know the rest of the story, filed a civil lawsuit in the Federal District Court in Paducah. Federal District Court, based on diversity of citizenship. They were now Indiana citizens. These were all Kentucky defendants. The amount in controversy, which changes through the times, was $10,000. So he had a lawsuit, a federal civil lawsuit in federal court. And you say, well, what difference does that make? Well, in federal court, you don't just draw your juries from nearby counties. At that time, the juries were being drawn from the Western District of Paducah all the way up to the Louisville area. So they were going to be able to get jurors from outside the Black Patch. The night riders weren't very popular outside the Black Patch because people saw them as kind of an embarrassment. Well, look, we got these feuds in the mountain, and we got all this, and we got the night riders out there shooting up towns, taking over. They weren't very popular. So they weren't going to get a lot of supporters in those jurors coming out of Elizabethtown, Litchfield, that area back up in there, who came to Paducah for what the night riders later would call the Paducah case. In 1908, Mary Lou Hollowell and Robert came to Paducah as that trial was set. The state militia was moved in and was encamped around the courthouse for protection. Instead of Mary Lou and Robert coming down through Henderson that way to Paducah, they had to go over across Illinois into Brookport, and then they were picked up by the state militia and escorted into Paducah for this trial. Well, the trial went off. It took about a week. First time they tried it, they had a hung jury. There was a guy named W.R. Grisham on that. Had two people from down this way, one from Wingo and W.R. Grisham from Catawba, my hometown. Well, W.R. Grisham was a night rider. He'd taken the night rider oath about a week before, but Mary Lou insisted that he be left on there because he said he was a friend of the family. Well, he wasn't a friend of the family, as it turned out, and he hung up the jury, and they had a hung jury. They set it down about a month later, and this time it didn't make the same mistake. All the jurors from outside the Black Patch area, they returned a verdict against these 30 night riders of $35,000. In 1908, that's a big sum. Well, that verdict reverberated throughout the Black Patch of West Kentucky and West Tennessee like a rifle shot. Because up until that time, the night riders had been immune from prosecution. And now the lawsuits began falling like rain. They began falling like rain. Lawsuits began, criminal prosecution began against David Amos. And the night riders began to meet now, not to organize raids upon towns or whippings upon independent hillbillies, but to try to raise money for the Paducah case, to pay off that judgment for their brothers. In fact, it was told that two friends met on the streets of Princeton one day. One was the defendant, and the other one was a friend of his. And he said, "Hey, Larry, Lawrence, where you been? I haven't seen you in a long time." He said, "I've been worming tobacco for Mary Lou." Working to pay off that judgment. Well, that was a deterrent effect. That began to turn the nose of the ship, and then the night rider popularity began to drain to then the onerous tobacco tax in Congress was repealed. Prices began to rise. The 1911 U.S. Supreme Court case ruled that American Tobacco Company violated the Sherman antitrust laws, ordered that it be busted up, and things began to improve. The economic the night riders. David Amos was indicted over in Christian County. We're going to try him again on Saturday night over in Hopkinsville. We've been trying him for 100 years. He was acquitted. I told somebody the other day, I said, we're going to convict him this time. I'm thinking when we reenact that, and I'm going to tell the juror, come back, let's see if anybody knows the difference. Come back with a guilty plea. And the night rider movement began to fizzle out. The night riders had garnered front page headlines of stores across the nation, including the New York Times, Harper's, Charlotte Observer. Sinclair Lewis even mentions the night riders of Kentucky as late as 1937 in his novel, It Can't Happen Here. This whole violent epoch is pretty much lost to the rest of this country because it happened here in the backwaters of Kentucky and West Kentucky and Tennessee. In terms of an epilogue, I'll follow up by bringing you up to where some of these characters, some of these master spirits of the age went from the night rider time period. David Amos, as I said, was tried in Hopkinsville. Denny Smith, the Commonwealth attorney who had been a night rider sympathizer and wouldn't prosecute any, in 1911 ended up prosecuting David Amos. Whoa, what happened here? Well, Denny Smith saw that the popularity of the night riders was changing, and the popularity was moving to the other way. And about 2 or 3 weeks before he tried David Amos, he filed a run for Attorney General of the state of Kentucky. So this is going to give him a lot of exposure, and he's going to get David Amos convicted. And that was going to put him in good with the anti-night rider. The only problem, a little bump along the way, poor old Denny, he didn't win the case. David Amos was acquitted. 2 weeks later, what did Denny do? He withdrew from the race of Attorney General. So that's what happened with David Amos's trial. Only 4 years later, David Amos died on November the 3rd, 1950, at the Rockefeller Sanatorium in New York Center, just a few blocks from the Duke Mansion on Madison Avenue. He died of throat cancer. James B. Duke, unfazed by the Supreme Court ruling, he and Ben carried on. They had a third brother named Brody. Brody was kind of a playboy. He wasn't much involved in the constructive part of that trust. He was kind of the black sheep of the family. Ben, David Duke's brother, did the charitable work. But in 1922, at the age of 66, Buck finally became interested in doing something to leave a more positive and creative legacy for the American Tobacco Company. And he became interested in a little Methodist Trinity College near Durham, North Carolina, and he wanted to do something to perpetuate the Duke legacy. He said, I want to leave something in this state that 500 years from now, people will say, Duke did that. So in 1924, and less than a year before his death, he endowed $6 million to Trinity on condition that it change its name to Duke University. Millions more was committed for construction of that campus. And if you haven't ever had the opportunity to go to Duke University, it is really an impressive place, a beautiful campus. He took keen interest in the establishment of a medical school, and Duke University was going up when James B. Duke died on October 25th, 1925. He wanted to establish the best medical facility, the best medical school in the world. So the first dean of medicine was Cornell Davison, who conducted a prodigious search for the first professor of medicine at Duke University. And he found his man, a man with remarkable credentials and a illustrious resume. He was a professor, this candidate was a professor at Johns Hopkins. He was an infectious disease specialist with two degrees from Harvard. He spent 10 years at the Rockefeller Medical Institute. He helped discover the cause of infantile paralysis. He had been a professor of medicine at Peking Medical College in China. He had an honorary degree from George Washington University, member of the Association of Medical Physicians, member of the American Society of Experimental Pathology, and on and on. His appointment as the first professor of Duke University was considered a real coup for this new university, and congratulations flooded in from all over the United States to Dean Davison. So this first professor then went to work putting together the first faculty and staff of what would become one of the finest medical schools in the world. And then I told you at the beginning, this has a fascinating beginning, it has a fascinating end. Here's the fascinating end as I conclude in my book on bended knees with these words. On July 19, 1930, just 2 days before the grand opening of what was destined to become one of the supreme medical facilities in the world, a group picture was taken of its elite first team. The combined administrative staffs of the School of Medicine, Nursing, and Didactics, as well as of that of the Duke Hospital, posed upon the steps of the Gothic entranceway to the new medical school. It was obviously a proud and dynamic assemblage of professionals. Squinting in the sunshine at the extreme right on the second row was this prestigious first professor of medicine at Duke University. He appeared slight and immaculately dressed. He was a Kentuckian. He was born into a long line of physicians. He was Dr. Harold L. Amos, son of the Knight Rider leader. Thank you very much. Question.